Welcome to Europe Debates. I'm Richard Milsom, the Director of the European Conservatives and Reformist Party in Brussels. Thank you for joining me for our weekly and popular series of webinars. Today's debate addresses the question of the European Green Deal. With the continent struggling to come to terms with what kind of recovery it will need following the coronavirus outbreak, the European Commission is pushing harder than ever to shoehorn in its European Green Deal. Critics have claimed that the European Green Deal will risk jobs and create energy shortages, whilst its proponents claim that it will boost Europe's economy and make it the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. Whether or not the European Green Deal is the right approach for protecting the environment, or whether it's just more hot air from the green left, today this will be our quest. This webinar is live streamed across multiple platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. And we're very grateful to the many people that have registered and will be following the debate live. Please do use the comment section to ask questions, which I will relay to the panel. So let's get it started, and I'd like to invite our panel to each give a 5-minute introductory remark, starting with our first panelist, Viscount Ridley. Now, Viscount Ridley is a world-renowned author and columnist and businessman, best known for his writings on science, the environment, and economics. His books have sold over 1 million copies, been translated into 31 languages, and have won many awards. His books include The Red Queen, The Origins of Virtue, Genome, Nature versus Nurture, Francis Crick, and The Rational Optimist and Evolution of Everything. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also Honorary President of the International Centre for Life in Newcastle. Since 2013, he's been a member of the House of Lords, and he writes a weekly column in The Times, and also writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, often on climate issues, the role of government, and Brexit. So, if I could ask Viscount Ridley to kick things off, climate change and environmental degradation are an existential threat to Europe and the world. To overcome these challenges, Europe needs a new growth strategy that transforms the Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. But is their Green Deal achievable within the time and budget and practical constraints, or is it even desirable?
Thank you very much, Richard. And if I could be very self-promoting and just add a new book to the list of ones that you've mentioned, because it came out this week. It's called How Innovation Works. It came out in America this week, comes out in the UK market in a few weeks' time. And I should declare one interest at the start, which is that I do have interests in the coal industry in the northeast of England still, but I've never been speaking in favor of coal. In fact, I usually speak for gas, which is coal's main competitor. So I'm not speaking my own book here. I want to make the case that the European Green Deal will be a mistake, will set Europe back, won't benefit the environment, and will be hugely damaging to the European economy. I want to start by it's all about energy at the moment, this question. Most of the focus of the environmental debate is on energy, which I think is a mistake. I think there are many other aspects of the environment we need to take into account. But energy is not just a raw material like paper or cement. It's the very source of wealth. An economy is a thermodynamic engine which creates useful structures for people out of using energy to reverse entropy. That's what we do. We sort of create little pockets of order in the world, and high energy costs can be extremely damaging for an economy over time. They get embedded into the capital costs of the economy, and they deter experimental innovation. It's vital to understand that the cost of energy is important. The policies we've been adopting in Europe and in the UK in particular in the last few years have in theory had 3 legs. 1, to be less carbon, 2, to be reliable as a source of energy, and 3, to be affordable. And we've completely neglected the 3rd leg. We really haven't paid it any attention at all. We have poured money into subsidizing the renewable energy industry in the belief that this will lower emissions. It hasn't been very successful in doing that, largely because of the need for backup and other problems to do with renewables. And it has not brought down the cost of renewable energy significantly. This is a myth that is out there. We're constantly hearing that the cost is rapidly falling. Now, the cost of an individual solar panel has indeed fallen a lot, but the cost of the land you install it on has gone up, the cost of the system that back it up, etc., etc. And in the case of wind power, we now have good empirical evidence from Gordon Hughes at Edinburgh University and other people showing very clearly that the capital expenditure on wind farms is going up, not down. So is the operational expenditure. So how come renewable energy industry is actually bidding relatively low prices for future contracts? Well, it's doing so as a foot in the door, and it's intending to sell these investments on to other investors who might believe that the lifespan of these technologies is longer than it probably is. Renewable energy has a very low return on energy invested. You put a lot of energy into making the structures. It's only after about 10 years that a wind farm is actually making more energy than has gone into its construction. And it takes about 150 tons of coal to build a wind farm. So in the UK, we are subsidizing renewable energy to the cost of around £10 billion a year. That has pushed our electricity prices up by about 35% for consumers, about 60% for industry. That is definitely hurting our competitiveness, and it is driving emissions abroad rather than getting rid of them altogether. We've seen a reduction in the reliability of our grid. We had blackouts last year that were directly caused by the instability caused by too much wind on the grid. And of course, we've done absolutely nothing about the 80% of our energy that is not electricity, the heating, the transport, and the industry uses of energy. And we know that those will cost trillions to decarbonize. It is not in doubt that the cost would be gigantic to switch to electricity for heating, to switch to hydrogen for transport, and so on. So you need to put that trillions cost against the so-called social cost of carbon. That is the cost of moving to not the cost of moving to net zero, the cost that climate change would impose upon the economy. And all estimates of the social cost of carbon are much, much lower than that. A calculation by Björn Lomborg recently said that if you look at all current climate policies, for every dollar that is spent, we're going to get 11 cents of benefit. And to put it in a clear scenario, the UN scenarios have the world being 450% richer in 2100 than they are today on average. But because of the effects of climate change, that 450% might be only 434% richer. So we're talking about the world becoming a little bit less rich in the next century, and we want to spend an absolute fortune to make sure that that doesn't happen. That isn't a sensible way to go about tackling this. And let's just put one number on this. What has changed in terms of the number of people killed by floods, droughts, or storms in the last 100 years? And the answer is 99% fewer people die as a result of droughts, floods, or storms today than 100 years ago around the world. There's been a dramatic reduction in that. There has not been an increase in mortality in that area. So what should we be doing instead as a continent? We should be funding research and development on energy technologies, because that is how we're going to solve this problem, is by coming up with a new technology, whether it's fusion or new forms of fission, that is low carbon and affordable. And that, I feel, would be a much better way for Europe to go, because it might end up with something we can export. The current policy of renewable energy favoritism is not exportable to other continents. Thank you.
Well, Viscount, thank you very much for that. So some excellent points. I'm going to return to the energy argument in a minute, but you made some very clear points about the cost of this thing. So perhaps I could turn to Alexander Vondra now, who's a Czech politician and a diplomat, who served as the Minister of Defense from 2010 to 2012 in the Czech Republic. He's a former senator and ambassador to the United States, and now serves as a European Member of Parliament since 2019 for the Civic Democratic Party. Alexander is the main voice of the European Conservatives and Reformists Parliament's Environment Committee, bravely taking on the European left ideology and collectivist green economics that dominate the current agenda. So you're there, you're in the thick of it, you're fighting the Conservative argument. But you know, the EU is banking on the Green Deal being the post-COVID great green recovery. Is this just pure ideology and the EU pushing things through, or is there any science-based evidence to support it?
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you for everybody listening. Hello. I would say 2 points on that. One is on the ideology and second more on the practical policy. On the ideology, I think that we conservatives are environmentalists, and there are plenty of examples from the past, you know, beginning by Teddy Roosevelt and ending with Margaret Thatcher, that the great politicians on the right had to do a lot for the environment, and we should do too. But the problem is that the Green Deal, as was submitted, there are some useful proposals, no doubt about that, but also it's filled with this ideological leftist revolutionary approach which wants to change the human nature, which reminds me this old statements, you know, about the Green parties when they emerged in Germany, that they're like a melon, then they are green on the cover, but if you cut this inside, you see the red. And that's the reason why I voted against the Green Deal when we had this in the European Parliament. And then on the practical terms, I think, you know, a lot has changed due to the crisis right now. That's not a crisis we just would have the European one. It's a global one because of the virus. And we need now to restart the economy, and we should exploit this as an opportunity to revise to postpone and to revise the Green Deal. In a couple of things. I don't expect, you know, China, India, Brazil, United States to join us in this solemn focus on eliminating CO2. They will not do that. And thus, even, you know, if Europe sacrifices everything, it will not have any effect. It will not have any impact. Secondly, you know, to force the people now who are losing their jobs to buy the expensive electric cars, to reconstruct their houses, I think that they will have plenty of different tasks, much more urgent than doing this. So we should be more realistic. And thirdly, there is a real environmental problem which would encompass at least half of Europe, and that's a drought. Drought in Germany, in Central Europe, in Southern Europe, the water scarcity. So we should do the things which we can change, or there can be some positive environmental impact on the short run, instead of focusing on something what would not have any impact at all in the short run, and maybe some impact in the distant future. So my position is clear. I want to change the Green Deal, but unfortunately, the majority in the European Parliament is just this red-green ideological majority filled with the revolutionaries who wants to change the human nature. And I think that once the people feel the impact, the costs of that, they will simply start to riot, do the same what they were doing once President Macron was trying to introduce some new taxes with the environmental pretext. And at the end of the day, he did nothing because he had to step back. So I would prefer much more realistic attitude and the less ideological one, but unfortunately that's what is a prevailing mood in Europe.
Well, thank you very much for that, Alexander. Depressing as it is, I'm afraid, that is the European Parliament that we have today, you know, it is. I see little chance of it being changed in that respect in the near future. Anyway, we should come back to some of those points. Could I please now turn to Ruža Tomasic, who is a Croatian member of the European Parliament since 2013. Firstly for the Croatian Party of Rights, and now as the founder of and leader of the Croatian Conservative Party. She's the most active Croatian MEP. She sits on the Fisheries Committee, the delegations for Bosnia, Kosovo and Canada. She's also done a lot on agriculture in the past. Formerly, she was a Canadian police officer in Toronto and Vancouver, specialising in juvenile delinquency and the drugs trade, including undercover work, as well as finding time to work as a stunt woman on 20 episodes of The X-Files and Millennium. Rightly, she is a proud mother and grandmother, and she joins us from the beautiful island of Korčula. Ruja, good afternoon to you. Perhaps we could bring in some of the other aspects here on how the Green Deal affects fishing, for example.
Well, since I'm on the both committees, I would like to talk about them both, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Because, you know, the European Commission wants to focus on the Green Deal more than ever now. But in this difficult time, measures that deal with COVID-19 pandemic must be the first priority. But in general, the Green Deal is not a complete strategy, and it is insufficiently financed. As a new policy, the Green Deal should be focused on how to help recovery and its transition into Industry 4.0, in particular, the circular and digitalization. The pandemic of COVID-19 has put a huge pressure on European economies and has already made many agriculture activities extremely exposed. We're facing the biggest crisis that the agriculture sector has seen in the last decades. The Commission must understand that we have to give our farmers security and to establish a specific agricultural fund outside the common agriculture policy budget. Also, our farmers need full flexibility in the interpretation and implementation of any new rules. Unfortunately, the farm to fork was adopted yesterday and within the Green Deal, and we wanted it to be postponed due to that same COVID-19 crisis. Taking into account the great importance of the security of food supply, as many European rural areas are already facing great challenges in terms of unemployment and a negative population growth. The Commission must propose now more than ever policies which are more effective and which create jobs in rural areas, which they so fondly talk about. As part of the Great Deal, zero pollution and the protection of wildlife are some of the priorities that will influence all EU sectoral policies. All industries will have an important part to play, and the EU fishing industry will certainly not be an exception. The fishing sector has been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 crisis. We need additional funding if we want to have a healthy fishing industry after the crisis. The fisheries sector welcomes the extraordinary measures quickly adopted last month, but still urges the European Commission to take further steps to cope effectively with this crisis. You know how they say charity begins at home, so they should think about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruja. Thank you. Okay, let me now turn to Mattias Karlsson, who's a Swedish MP and the former leader of the Swedish Democrats Party. He's been a member of the Riksdag for the Scania County since 2010 and has recently launched a foundation named Oikos, or Home, which is the first conservative think tank in Sweden for over 100 years. Mattias is a strong friend of the ECR party, and we're delighted to have you with us today. In the past, we've done some work on the environment around the Baltic Sea, and we've had one of our blue-green summits in Sweden, which you generously hosted. I want to kind of, two questions really for you, Mattias. One, firstly, can Europe afford to pay for all of these measures that are being put forward? But I think we need to talk a bit more about energy, and we haven't mentioned nuclear. Do you think nuclear should be included in the Green Deal?
Thank you, Richard. To start with, I think it needs to be said, given the propaganda coming from the left, that conservatives really care about the environment, and we really also should care about the environment. What sets us apart from our opponents on the left is that we actually love our countries. We actually love the landscape and the nature that surrounds us, and that gives us, I think, a special energy to also preserve the thing that we love. And if you look at the history of the preservation movement, like Alexander mentioned, it was conservatives who were the first ones to raise the issues of environment and preservation, and that is certainly the case in Sweden, where the first environmental movements were founded by patriots and conservatives. So I think we have a proud legacy in that regard, and I think that the things that we are doing are often more efficient, often doing more good than what the left wing and the green movement are doing, despite the very aggressive rhetoric coming from their part. And I also think that we need to cooperate across borders to solve environmental issues. You mentioned the Baltic Sea Summit that the ECR hosted in Stockholm last year, and I think that's a very good example of conservatives, people from different countries coming together to solve common environmental problems and agreeing on taking actions on things that concerns us all. And I think that is the way forward. There is no supranational force involved in this. We all do it because we love our environment. We also do it because we see these common problems, and we sit down together and see what is the best solutions to come to terms with this. With that said, my party and myself are very skeptical of the EU Green New Deal. I think there's you mentioned costs, and I think one of the big problems with this is that we don't really know the consequence of this monstrous reform, because there have been no real cost-benefit analysis of what this is going to lead to. We still don't really know how the EU and the different countries in the EU have been living up to the Paris Agreement. We don't know what kind of problems we have encountered. There's been no evaluation of that, and still now the EU wants to take it even further, even before knowing how we are coping with the agreements we already made. And I think that's a result of a fundamentalist way of looking at things. They just want to run fast, and they don't care about running in the right direction. I think, to me, it's more important to run in the right direction than to run as fast as possible. And I think that they want to appease the children crusade of Greta Thunberg and the fundamentalist green movement that has been very aggressive and has been gaining a lot of ground in the last few years. But that is not a responsible way to go about it. This is going to cost a lot of money. And will it lead to the target that they are setting out? We don't know. Probably the benefit of this, looking at the environment side of it, will be very, very small, if even any. And the cost will be enormous. And to take on this enormous cost of €1 trillion, or whatever the end result will be, in a situation where we are now fighting the corona crisis, and we are looking at a probable recession in most of our countries. We have a situation where people can't get healthcare in time, actually dying because of lack of resources. In my country, we don't even before the corona crisis, we didn't have enough resources to heat some of the elderly care centers, or for the police to catch rapists and murderers. All of these things needs to be balanced. What the green movement and the left are doing is that they are only focusing on environment and saying that we can spend an endless amount of money on this, not looking at what can we not afford if we do this. Because there is no certain tree where money for everything that is good and green grows, and that the EU can tap into. So it's going to be consequences, real consequences for ordinary people, if we set aside this much money on this single issue. And probably the benefit will be slim or nothing. Another aspect of this is, I think, the geopolitical or security side of it. We are taking on burdens on our industry that will weaken Europe and Europe's economy in regards to China. And in a situation where it looks unfortunately like we are going into a new Cold War. And we are seeing a situation where China are strengthening its position, buying up bigger and bigger portions of Europe. Just the other day, they bought the Norwegian Air Force air company, and we are seeing in Sweden several big industries already owned by the Chinese. If we are weakening ourselves even further, the Chinese influence in Europe will increase. I also think that the Green New Deal will make it harder for Europe to reach an agreement on a free trade agreement with the US. And I think that is very dangerous in this situation, because we need a closer cooperation. We need a stronger, more unified West to stand up against the threat of China and also Russia. And it will also make Europe more dependent on energy from outside, I think, because we will not be able to produce the amount of energy that we need with all these burdens that the green policies are putting on our industries. That will also make us more dependent on Russia. Like we have seen in Germany, for example, when they abolished their nuclear plants, what the result of that was that they became more and more dependent on Russian gas. And from a geopolitical perspective, that is disastrous, I think. And like you mentioned, Richard, Sweden has we have a big dependency on nuclear, and that has been very beneficial for us. We have water and nuclear, basically. But the left, they don't accept this because they don't like nuclear, because they always want the perfect thing, not the best thing that we have at the moment. And even though our possibilities to store the waste from the nuclear plants are pretty much optimal, they still want to cancel our nuclear plants. We had a ban for decades to do research on nuclear. So Swedish scientists and engineers have not been by law allowed to take part in the development to try to reach the fourth generation of nuclear plants that could probably solve the whole energy issue and a lot of the environmental issues. And I think it's a big flaw in the Green New Deal that nuclear is not in focus. I think without nuclear energy, it will not be possible to reach a more carbon-free energy sector, and especially it will not be possible to do it whilst also preserving prosperity and economical wealth in Europe, and not weakening Europe even further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mattias. You mentioned Germany here, because which is vitally important. They seem to have just let the Green Deal slip through the European procedures. And of course, by shunning nuclear power and embracing alternative energy, the net result has been they're burning more coal than ever. And they are geopolitically very weak, being so reliant on Nord Stream and Russian gas. Perhaps I could turn back to Viscount Ridley. Can Europe afford to switch off the coal-fired power plants? Or do we need to revisit nuclear within the Green Deal? You unmute.
There we are. I'm unmuted now. Apologies. It's not for me to specify the energy mix that any particular European country should have in the future. One of the things that's been most disturbing about the last 10 years is that we've gone from a situation in which, on the whole, the market determined how our electricity was generated or our energy was produced, to a situation in which politicians determine it. So I'm not here to say we must pick one technology and not another. But Mattias is quite right that if you are serious about decarbonizing an economy, then you must embrace nuclear. There is no other technology that can possibly get you there, let alone affordably. None of the idea that you can run an economy entirely on renewables is simply impractical. There is not enough land, there is not enough steel, there is not enough air and water, and there is not enough environmental tolerance for these kind of things. The impact on the landscape, on birds, on wildlife and so on is too high. So nuclear is the only way we can go. We have unfortunately cut nuclear power off from the process that would have enabled it to be more innovative and to become more safe, more efficient, and more affordable over the years. And that is the process of trial and error, the process of innovation. And we've done that by regulating it in such a way that it has to specify a long way in advance exactly what it will build down to the last nut and bolt. And that means that it is impossible to do the sort of tweaking and changing and learning from doing that is important in innovation. We must make sure that fusion energy and fourth generation fission energy is not similarly hampered. Because it looks like by the end of this decade, we will have practical fusion reactors, and we probably will have molten salt, molten metal reactors doing fission, which will be inherently much safer and thoroughly making energy with zero carbon affordably. But to get there, we have to do a lot of research, we have to do a lot of experimentation, and we have to get over our phobia of nuclear power. I think it's quite possible that coal can be dispensed with. I say that as someone from the northeast of England, where the entire wealth was built on coal. And coal has played a very important part. For a start, coal saved the forests of the world. If we hadn't discovered coal, we would have cut down every last tree on the planet by now to fuel the modern economy. But in Britain, we have shown that we can do without coal for electricity, that we still need coal for other things, but because we don't like the idea of mining it here, we import it from Russia. Well, the carbon footprint of that is enormous, and the dependence on Russia is not a good position to be in the current world. So I think it's all about allowing research, development, and innovation in energy systems. That's what we need to be focused on. That's what the Green Deal should be focused on.
Yes, I know, I totally agree. Thank you. Alexander Vondra, should energy independence be a key part of European environmental policy?
Well, certainly it's worth of pursuing that, maybe not 100%, but the fact is that, oil we are importing from the Middle East, the gas we are importing from Russia, so both are the very unstable and problematic corners of the world. So any kind of improving of our energy independence would be appreciated. But I would underline one thing, that without nuclear, we are not able to do that. And, given that just the example of my country, the Czech Republic, traditionally we were part of this coal belt together with Germany, Poland. Most of our energy was produced via coal power plants. We are phasing out. We will phase completely out until 2050. Even, we do not need the European Union to that. But the only way how to do it is to continue in our nuclear program. We have 2 nuclear power plants. They are serving very well. The people like that. There is not any anti-nuclear stand among the people. And what I take as my personal goal is to defeat this anti-nuclear majority in the European Parliament. Because we need to take the healthy reasons to admit that with now nuclear we cannot do that, simply because the water, the sun, water, wind in our country, it's impossible. It's unstable. It's not much of them. So the other way around is to import more gas from Russia, but that's not the solution for us. So nuclear, and together with that, as Matt has mentioned that, to invest into R&D, especially in the nuclear, because here Europe is totally lacking behind. This ideological blindness effectively kills its ability to compete in the power terms with not only with Russia, but also with others throughout the world. So nuclear energy, that's the way forward. But we have the problem because of the stupidity of the political elites in Germany, as well as among most of the Greens, social democrats throughout Europe, because most of them they are against. We need to defeat them.
Lovely, thank you very much. Ruja, I know in Croatia the energy mix is slightly different in that you have more hydro and geothermal as well as nuclear. But I know you want to talk about agriculture. So can I just go a little bit further on how, for example, the reduction in pesticides might be harming agriculture in your country?
Well, when it comes to pesticides, we need realistic targets for the use of pesticides, but they have to be based on the results of a detailed impact assessment, and it should take into account different national circumstances. So it all depends what do you grow, where you grow it, and how much, what kind of pests you have and everything. So we need a detailed and realistic impact assessments, but we're not doing it. We're just making the laws in Brussels and expect member states to adopt to it. And it's not very realistic what they want.
Yeah, okay, nice. Okay, perhaps I could turn back to Matthias and how Green New Deal is potentially affecting tourism in your country, particularly Baltic Sea tourism. You mentioned the Baltic Sea Summit we did earlier last year. The Baltic Sea is one of the dirtiest seas, and that's partly due to Russia spilling out waste into the sea, but it's having a huge impact, on tourism and on other industries in the area. And what do you see that could be done to help that?
Yeah, I think one of the risks of focusing too much on one single environmental issue, as I think that the Green New Deal and a lot of the debate that has been going on for the last few years, everything is about the greenhouse effect and carbon emissions, is that we forget about other environmental issues that it's in many cases more close to home. And the situation in the Baltic Sea has been terrible for a couple of decades now. And I was really grateful to the ECR party that you took on yourself to, both the ECR party and the ECR group in Parliament, to really take this issue seriously and to come up with the Baltic Sea Declaration and the conference, the Blue-Green Summit that we had. Because this is affecting, ordinary working class people who cannot afford to go to the Maldives and then pay some extra tax on carbon emissions for their first class flight to the Maldives. This is ordinary working class people that for them the vacation paradise for them is the Baltic Sea. They go there to camp out with their families and so forth, but for many years, it wasn't even possible to go swimming in the Baltic Sea because it was a porridge of algae because of fertilizers being emissioned into the water and so forth. So I think we need to focus more on this close to home environmental issues that really affects the ordinary citizens and the everyday man in our countries, because basically they are the ones paying the taxes. They are the ones paying for all these projects, and they need to get something back. And I think that we can get more concrete results if we start by taking our love of home in regards as an energy and a force to save the environment. And I think we'll also get a more enthusiastic response from the public in order to do this. And of course, this is harming the tourist industry, as you said, and harming therefore also economical growth in the region. So we need to come together and try to do whatever we can in concrete measures, and we can do a lot of things. We can help farmers to use alternative fertilizers. I think we should also try to incorporate in our negotiations with Russia. Like if they continue to pollute our environment, that needs also to have consequences in regards to Russia, for example. And so it's very important that we don't stare ourselves blind on these big global issues all the time, but also look at the environmental issues that is very close to home and close to our hearts.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthias. Very important. If I turn to Ridley again, COP26 is due to take place later this year. What would you like to see as a result of that, if it takes place, of course. And how would you advise Alok Sharma, who's the business secretary, who is going to be obviously negotiating for us, on what they should be putting forward?
Well, before I answer that, I'd like to just endorse what Matthias said about local environmentalism being so much more important, and the degree to which the global warming issue has devoured all the oxygen in the room and starved other conservation issues, environmental issues of attention is to me very shocking. I am very interested. I'm a very keen naturalist. I'm a very keen conservationist. I'm a keen bird watcher. Wherever I go in the world, the threats that I see to habitats and rare species are nearly always from invasive species, from invasive alien species. This is the big issue. This is the cause of most extinctions in the world, and it's something we can do something practical about. I went to the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia some years ago and saw the effects of the eradication of rats on that island and the huge increase in bird numbers. This is the kind of project we should be doing in the name of conservation, rather than constantly obsessing with climate change. I mean, I'm involved in UK projects where the national emphasis is always on measuring the effects of climate change on blanket bogs, on species composition, etc., and never on the local issue that really matters. So I do think that it has swallowed too much attention and prevented us doing real practical issues such as invasive species. But to your question about COP26, it is not going to happen in Glasgow in December. It has already been postponed. In theory, it will happen in a year's time. It will involve 25,000 people flying around the world to tell us not to fly in airplanes, which is ironic, I think we can all agree, if not hypocritical. And it will be a failure. We know that because we've had 25 of these before, and they've always been failures. That is to say, they set out to achieve something mandatory, something internationally agreed, and they never do. The most famous failure, of course, was Copenhagen in 2009. But after that, remember, the emphasis was on getting mandatory agreements in 2015 in Paris. And the organizers said they would accept nothing less. It had to be mandatory. It would be a failure if it wasn't. At the last minute, they changed the goalposts and said, no, we can't get mandatory, but voluntary agreements would be preferred. So it will be, I'm afraid, just a recitation of pious promises. Now, I have been lobbying the British government to say it would be helpful if you could show some projects that show what might actually make a difference, not just empty promises. And one way in which I think Britain could show a lead here, if you are as obsessed with the carbon dioxide issue, as most people are, would be to get a market going to discover ways of doing carbon capture more cheaply. This is to say, burying carbon dioxide under the North Sea, which Norway has shown is already possible. But what we don't have is a means of driving down the cost of this. And the way to do that is to say to energy companies, bury a small proportion of the carbon dioxide you produce, just 0.5% to start with. We don't mind where you get it from or how much, or how you do it. We're not going to specify the technology, but you have to prove you've done it. And that will create a market in which good conservative free market principles will show how we can discover technologies and drive down the costs of technologies that will help. Because there's no way we can achieve net zero with renewables alone, and probably not with nuclear alone. We are going to have fuels for flying aeroplanes, and that means we're going to have a way of removing carbon dioxide from the air, and that means carbon capture.
Yeah, well, thank you. So, Matthias, was Boris right to pull the USA out of the Paris Agreement?
You mean Trump, don't you?
Sorry. It was Trump. was Trump correct in pulling the US out of the US? And also, with all of these schemes that the EU is designing for carbon capture, and are they not just subsidy systems, which are basically anti-competitive and protectionist in their nature?
It's very hard for me to be a judge on American policy, but I would say that I think that the focus on when it comes to our environmental issues, there's too much symbolism. There's too much, trying to look good and saying the right things, and too little of actually doing something that actually matters. And looking at what Trump did, for example, the plan to plant a billion trees, I think that is actually doing something. It's very easy to sign a treaty and then not follow it, like many of the countries, I think, who signed the Paris Agreement did. And I think also that we need to balance these things. We need to, how much money can we spare on environmental projects? That's the first thing the question we need to ask ourselves. Then we should ask ourselves, how do we spend this money as efficient as possible, making the use of this money as great as it can be, because we also have other needs in society, and we need to look at the whole picture. What the problem with the environmental issue, the environmental movement and the left, is that they only see this, but the cost of making very, very expensive projects on environmental, leaving less money, for example, to save lives in the healthcare system, to provide security for ordinary citizens when they are being abused or raped or terrorized, fighting terror, whatever it may be. We have a lot of very urgent issues, and we need to balance these interests. And I think a lot of the criticism against Trump and others are that they are trying to do just that they are not just only fundamentally looking at the environmental issue as isolated, but also see the need to have a economical growth, security policy, and providing the basic needs to the population.
Excellent, thank you, Matthias. So Alexander Vondra, we're jumping a bit because it's such a broad subject and there's so many different elements to this, but what are achievable goals? I mean, is reducing single-use plastics or improving fuel efficiency in car, is this realistic?
Well, I don't know whether it's realistic to have a complete non-plastic world. We just have seen, for example, this pandemic crisis, how it raised the use of single-use plastic, at least in the short run, because there is not any substitution yet. And the hospitals, they simply need to operate in a certain environment. So, but I'm very much in favor of promoting the non-waste economy, even the circular economy, although it should be done in a way that it's market comfortable. So to have a competitive environment, which is usually the environment which helps us to improve the various innovations. With regards to the fuels, again, I think that we need an environment which would pursue the different options. Right now, we are too much, I think, betting on the electromobility. Electromobility is fine, if you are living in a big city, to purchase a small electromobile, it's certainly an improvement. But, there are other environments. If you are living in a scarce density of population and you need to drive your car 50 kilometers every day, then it's it's less efficient. And we have also to think about, if we are doing something, what this would have an impact on the environment. One example, we have betting too much on the biofuels in the past, which has led to, those large oil seed fields in Europe with this yellow colors, or an expansion of the palm trees plantations in the countries like Indonesia or Brazil. And the impact, the positive impact on energy, on the CO2 emission was very limited, while there was a devastating impact on the environment. For example, in Indonesia, we all know the problem with the orangutans and the cutting the tropical forest trees. And even in our country, those oilseed fields, there's a problem because it eliminates the biodiversity. It contributes to the water scarcity. So I think it's important to check also if we are going to do some steps to have a detailed impact assessment. What are the impacts, not just in the positive, but also on the negative sides for the environment? And that's something what we are unfortunately not doing enough. And here I think it's very important that every step which we are doing should be deeply impact assessed before doing that. So it's not an ideological policy. It should be a practically oriented policy. And that's, I think, another big goal which is ahead of us.
Thank you, Alexandra. So Ruja, Viscount Ridley was talking about local protection of environments and things. What are the key things that you would prioritise in Croatia as being the sort of three most important areas where you think additional pressure should be brought to bear on the Commission regarding the
three most important for Croatia is tourism, agriculture, and fishing industry. And the problem is that since we joined the European Union, our politicians feel like all the laws the European Union makes, and we just have to listen to them. We're not allowed to say anything, and it's not true. And like my colleague said, we do need detailed impact assessment regarding everything. We need to see what impact it's going to have on the short term and the long term, but we're not doing it. And now the Croatia is not going to have much tourism this year. It's going to be very, very hard. And our agricultural land was left to stagnate because everybody turned to tourism. And when it comes to fishing, there's so many laws that are being passed that fishermen, they just don't see that it works for them. So a lot of the fishermen abandon their ships, their boats, and they're doing something else.
Yeah.
So we need more communication from Brussels to our government or to any government from any little country. We need much more communication to see what can happen, what should happening, and to kind of give us or any post-communist country to give a little push, because it seems like during the communism time they told us what to do, when to do it, how to do it, right? So now all the post-communist countries, they think that Brussels is going to do the same thing. Like, Brussels really don't care, as long as you pay in your debt.
Yeah, and I do hope we can all go on holiday to Corchula this year as well.
Well, you're all invited to. I have enough space.
Now we've got a few minutes left, so I just want to do one quick round of sort of final comments. But I wanted to add to that, Viscount Ridley, there was a question that came in from the Healthy Online debate. Do you have an opinion on the impact of Brazil's current policy on the Amazon rainforest and a proposal for addressing the issue if you consider a solution necessary? Perhaps you can have a crack at that. Just unmute.
Apologies.
Yeah.
I keep forgetting to unmute. You'd think by now, after weeks of this, one wouldn't remember to do it. I would like to address the issue of deforestation generally. I think it's a terribly important issue. I'm not specifically well briefed enough on Brazil's own policies. The extraordinary thing is that the world is now adding forest every year. The amount of forest in the world is increasing. That's mostly true in the Northern Hemisphere. It's less true in the tropics, where there is net loss of forest in some countries. But what's really striking is that it happens much more in rich countries than poor countries. Europe is seeing a huge increase in tree cover and has been for decades now. Same with North America. But Africa is still seeing deforestation. So in other words, the richer you are, the better you look after your forest situation. In fact, it's quite specific. When a country gets to about $5,000 per year average income, it starts reforesting. It stops deforesting and starts reforesting. So Bangladesh, for example, passed that threshold about 10 years ago, and it is adding forest to itself at the moment. So the one thing that we know that works to prevent deforestation and start reforestation is wealth, is prosperity. And if you just think about three species of animal, the wolf, the lion, and the tiger, wolves are increasing, lions are decreasing, and tigers are roughly holding their own at the moment. Why is that? Because wolves live in rich countries, lions live in poor countries, and tigers live in middle-income countries. That's the best recipe for looking after the environment, is to get people rich, and then they reduce their pressure on the natural environment.
Thank you very much. I love that analogy with the wolves, lions, and tigers. Excellent. So, a few minutes left. Could I go to Alexander Vondra just for a few final words, and perhaps your three recommendations to the Commission with regards to Green Deal?
No, just I would understand what Matt has said, because the wolves are back in our country after 200-year absence, and every year in last couple of years I'm listening to them, to their singing, and even I'm watching them, and it's I really love that. And they are living in some kind of a not a harmony, but the Czechs are learning how to live with them, I would say, successfully. But I would say that the forests are the problem, because with the water scarcity, with the warmer climate, with the various diseases, we do have the problem with dying forests. So yes, we can talk with President Bolsonaro or with Indonesians, but we also should start at home to do something to have a better protection of the water resources and the ability to contain the water in the countryside. It is relevant for protecting our biodiversity. So I just want to underline this beyond everything else what I have already said. So, but now the priority, I would say, at least from the perspective of Central Europe, and what I would be talking to the Commission is water, water, water.
Splendid, thank you. So, Matthias, just a few final words. There's lots of forests in Sweden, and you were with me when we were with the Pakistan Minister of Environment, who was responsible for planting 1 billion trees in the billion tree tsunami. I mean, obviously it was state funded and stuff, but there was a lesson there in massive scale reforestation. But perhaps, Matthias, just a few final closing comments.
Yeah, just to address that, we actually have more trees now than we ever had. And that is without any, government regulation. The Swedish forests are mostly owned by, private farmers. And they are actually preserving more of the forests than they are obliged to by law, because they actually love their forest. And I think that is it's a good lesson to learn from that. We need to focus on addressing local environmental issues, take in account the people's love of home, and try to preserve the landscape that we actually have feelings for, and not only focus on the big global scene of things. But I think that the main solutions to all of these problems we have been addressing is more research. I think we really don't have all the solutions yet. But I think if we're going to spend money, if we want to spend common money from the EU or other organizations, they should go to research and development. Because I think every dollar or euro or Swedish krona that we spend on research and development will pay out tenfold in the future. And instead of focusing on subsidizing inefficient energy sources of energy, or trying to ban or put a wet cloth over European business and industry.
Thank you, Matthias. And I shall leave the last word to Ruja.
I just want to say that it's been reported that the COVID-19 pandemic cut carbon emission down to 2006 level, but nobody is celebrating because the world economy is at the low point because of this pandemic, and the world is not prospering due to the carbon emission cut, just the opposite. So it proves that something that's good for the environment is not necessarily good for the human race.
Awesome. Excellent, Ruja. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of our discussion. There's so much to talk about, but so little time. I'd just like to extend a huge vote of thanks to all of our panel members for your expertise and giving us your time. It's been a very interesting debate. So thank you on behalf of ECR Party. Thank you very much to all of you. And also thank you to all of those that have been watching it online. The whole discussion is recorded at our website, and people can view that at a later time. Please do join us again next week, Thursday, the 28th of May, at the earlier time of 12 o'clock Central European Time, for our next webinar entitled The European Elections 1 Year On. Details can be found at the ECR Party website, as well as on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So thank you to all of you, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Stay safe, and I hope to see you again here next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Great to meet you, everyone.